Hey, class. This is Carlos coming to you digitally from the past, the very recent past. Welcome to pandemic uh, times. We still need to discuss the biggest thing in the world, more dangerous than this pandemic, and you will understand what I mean after these next few lectures. I'm going to try to go through these in 10 or 15-minute chunks. And so I'll try to find a natural stopping point um, just so that you can focus on a particular topic. So with that said, um, let's continue our discussion from last time. Frying pan to fire, heat death, wildfires, and climate conflict. So when last we left, I was asking what kind of an issue is climate change? And if you recall, there were a couple of possibilities. We even did a poll in class that sort of mapped onto this. This was a study from last year. The numbers don't change that much year to year. Most people think climate change is an environmental issue. Relatively few think it's a religious issue. Health, political, economic, is all in between. The previous class, we talked about it being a scientific issue, agricultural issues, specifically farming and food. Um, and we touched a little bit on economics. We'll talk more about economics in the future. Today, we're going to cover a bunch more of these. We're going to talk about global warming as an environmental issue, as a severe weather issue, not as a political issue. That'll be the end of this section. So one of the two or three final discussions on climate change will be on the politics of it, politics and economics, really. We'll talk about social justice, poverty, and national security in this talk. But primarily, we're going to focus on climate change as a health issue. So there's a lot of ways in which the climate influences your health. Some are pretty obvious, and you think about, heat waves, wildfires, floods. Those have direct impact on individual people. People that suffered through Hurricane Katrina or Maria or whatnot were aware that the climate was affecting their health. But there's also a lot of indirect ways that climate change can affect health. So one way is it could change the physical systems around you. Here I'm thinking in terms of increased pollution, urban islands, heat islands we'll talk about. It can just change the environment around you. It might also affect biology, right? So if the environment was being modified by climate change, organisms evolve to fit their environment by simple principles of evolution by natural selection. And so you get very quick evolutionary changes within a couple of generations, right? So in insect terms, a couple of generations could be a couple of years. Mosquito numbers range will change as the climate changes. We'll talk about that. As temperatures increase, crop yields get less efficient. We've talked about that before. It can also change entire ecosystem structures. So by changing the environment, we change the nutrient availability, we change flora and fauna, we change wildlife diversity, and all of those have knock-on effects. Some of those could be good, right? I don't want to say that these are all bad. It really depends on where you live and what you're used to. But by and large, most change is bad for people that are used to the world as it has been. And so it disrupts society, economies, and demographics, distribution of individual peoples and groups. And all of those also have health impacts. There's lots of evidence for this. The direct effects are pretty obvious. You see the health impacts when people show up to emergency rooms. But you can also do spatial and temporal studies, right? So see where climate has varied in space and time, and see where very similar populations, say Kentucky versus Tennessee or Austria versus Germany, how they have been affected based on how climate has differentially impacted one area versus another. You could also study that same area, the same population over long periods of time, and see how that change has affected people and the environment. And lastly, you could do laboratory experiments or field studies. So um, we can directly observe, we can do spatial or temporal studies, which are what philosophers of science call natural experiments. Here I'm using inverted quote marks. I don't know if you can hear that. But nature sometimes sets up the world around you in a particular way that can provide evidence. Or you can use experiments and field studies, which are the types of science that you're probably more familiar with. Natural experiments are going to come up more in the final third of this class when we talk a little bit more about health and some of those effects where we might not be barred from conducting experiments by space and time the way we are with climate change, but rather we are prevented from engaging in some experiments for ethical reasons. So you can observe the world. That's what the first three are: individual studies, spatial studies, temporal studies. Or you can go into a laboratory or into an area that you carefully control near nature, in nature. Field studies, by the way, are supposed to be a hybrid between experiments and natural experiments. Okay, I spent way too long making this graphic, and I'm unreasonably proud of it, so deal with it. As temperatures rise, as you increase CO2, we saw from the argument in the beginning of this section, temperatures rise, which causes more and more extreme weather, which raises sea levels, which is going to release more carbon dioxide, which is going to raise. So it's this pretty brutal cycle. And there's consequences from this cycle going on. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. Severe weather, air pollution, increased allergens. We'll talk about all of these. Today we'll talk about extreme heat and environmental degradation and water and food supply impacts. The basic idea is when the world changes around you, everything changes. I feel like I don't need to emphasize that to people who might be out of work. Sorry if you are, by the way, and please let me know. Or people that are locked in their homes because the world has changed around us, right? The environment changes, you change. Sometimes the environment changes really drastically. Hurricane Harvey a couple of years ago really hit Texas. There's some brutal irony that a lot of people left Katrina after it had been hit in 2005. And a good number of those people left New Orleans to move to Houston. And they bought property in parts of Houston that didn't have good flood drainage, that didn't expect once in 1,000-year floods to hit them in the next couple of years. And so a lot of houses were underwater. A lot of people really suffered. We had to set up temporary housing in gymnasiums and stadiums and whatnot. It was, it's a bad scene when your entire neighborhood and worldly possessions get washed away. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to the people who had just fled one of the biggest hurricanes to ever hit US soil, only to be hit by another of the biggest ones. I have a friend who studies disasters. He's a historian. And I think anybody who studies disasters will tell you there's no such thing as a natural disaster. There's a reason that the homes that were washed away and that were differentially affected by this were all in the poor parts of town. So my friend who studies natural disasters says every natural disaster is actually secretly an economic disaster. It's the poor people that suffer, that lose their homes. And we'll see that again and again and again. So that was Harvey. Right after Harvey that year, there was Hurricane Irma in the bottom right. This is a picture that is to scale, showing the biggest hurricane of the 20th century, Andrew, side by side with Irma. And as you can see, these storms are very different in size. And yet, because we developed our categorization system for hurricanes in the 20th century, we consider them the same kind of storm. Let me see if I can share this YouTube video with you all. Doop, 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 doop. The answer appears to be no. Okay. Well, you can click that video on your own time. I also want to talk about that idea of economic disasters. The people that suffer the most in natural disasters are the people that cannot recover. And sadly, we tend to ignore these people and forget about these people. I hope Congress comes through right now for those of you that are doing shift work and service work who don't have jobs anymore. I hope we're able to get you guys some funding to meet your bills this month. But in the past, we've let a lot of people behind. And here, thinking about Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico, and then it became a political football back and forth between the president and the mayor of one of the towns and the governor as well, where one side tried to downplay the number of casualties, and the other side tried to report that it was bad and that they needed funding. Congress passed $8.7 billion of relief for the people of Puerto Rico, but as of today, they've only received about $2 billion of those dollars. So I want to end this section here on a discussion of something called environmental racism. Environmental racism is the discrimination or enforcement of certain rules to particularly target minority groups. So, for example, Flint, Michigan, water was tainted with lead there, and it was discovered in 2016 that it was due to the governor trying to attempting to save a couple of $100 with the piping that led to Flint. You still can't drink the water there. It's still bad to drink the water there. If that had happened in Beverly Hills or Broadway, I think we would have seen a completely different response. But sadly, some people just don't have a lot of political pull. And you can see this in what are called super fun sites. where it turns out that you can directly map where we dump some of the worst chemicals and toxins, and where we put the most polluting plants directly in poor and minority communities. There's almost a perfect overlap. I want to believe that it's not that we hate poor people, it's just that they don't have representation, they don't have political power, they don't organize, partly because it's hard. But maybe we do hate poor and minority people. I say this to a bunch of Nevadans who, a lot of you right now are living in a state that doesn't have lots of nuclear waste being buried in it, purely because of politicians that were politically connected in the recent past. So this stuff matters. Okay, I'm going to stop here and restart this lecture in a little bit. The basic recap is we've talked about how climate change can have health impacts, and we focused on the big health impacts, right? So hurricanes and whatnot. We talked about how natural disasters are also economic disasters every single time. And we talked about how there are direct and indirect ways of assessing this. And some of these can be assessed using laboratory studies, but a lot of these have to be assessed by looking at maps kind of like this, where you map out spatial distribution and minority populations and find that very few of the worst places, the toxic release facilities, very few of these are in places that are majority middle class and white. Okay, I'll see you guys shortly.